Radioactivity in the exclusion zone around Chernobyl. Are we threatened by a new nuclear disaster? We find out what has been happening in the radioactive atomic ruin and how dangerous its occupation by Russian troops really was. What's happening at occupied Zaporizhzhia, and what are the implications of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant being in the hands of the military?
If you damage the full core of one reactor, the consequences would be the same like Chernobyl.
Experts fear that a power cut will result in core meltdown.
We are meant to care about nuclear safety. If we allow this to continue time after time, then one day our luck will run out.
We talk to people who ensure the safety of nuclear power plants day after day, including under occupation and under fire, in facilities that were never expected to be in a war zone. The suburbs of Kiev bear clear traces of the Russian invasion. In April 2023, we traveled to a land in the grip of a war, to a country which generates more than half its energy from nuclear power. I tell my colleague Dirk Lustig, who will be translating for us, that I'm a physicist. I've twice been to Chernobyl and also made 2 trips to Fukushima, both the scene of nuclear disasters. I've spent many years researching the safety of nuclear power, but up to now, always in peacetime. In a war, we have to wear protective gear, something Dirk is quite at home with. Born in Switzerland, he has been living in Ukraine for more than 30 years. As a journalist, he visits war zones time and again.
So,
turn around. A perfect fit. Excellent.
Sehr gut.
We're not off to the front, so will I really need this?
Hopefully you won't. It's just in case of an air raid or a drone attack.
Several alert apps have been created. Dirk shows us that the only alerts at the moment are near the front line. Ukraine has 5 nuclear power plants. Chernobyl was closed. Zaporizhzhia is occupied and was shut down. One of the 3 atomic power stations still active is Khmelnytsky. We want to find out what happens in a nuclear power plant in wartime conditions. The reactor units at Khmelnytsky are of the same type as those at Zaporizhzhia, which is occupied by the Russian military. War changes the operating conditions. So basically, nuclear power plants are out of bounds to journalists. But we were given permission to visit the training center, so we can report on nuclear power in wartime. Vasyl Sluchansky runs the training center. As best he can, he also has to prepare his staff for war scenarios. This room is known as the simulator. It looks exactly like an actual control room, right down to the last push button. Everything has to be as real as possible. The coaches disappear behind darkened glass. Everything is recorded.
The staff have no idea what this test will involve.
But Vasyl Sluchansky revealed us that one aggregate is about to fail as a result of an apparent air attack. Under time pressure, the team have to check the file and find the right instructions for this particular emergency. They mustn't get anything wrong, and they have to work well together, even under stress.
There was a total power cut, no electricity. So now, systems that are important for the safety of the plant are being kept in operation by 3 diesel generators.
Sluchansky is happy with the way his team handled the scenario, which this time was highly complex.
І потім оцінюємо дії кожного учасника тренування. І виникають моменти, коли ситуація дуже динамічна, багато дій, коли через один учасник такого режиму людина виснажена психоемоційно.
One colleague was so mentally and physically exhausted after an hour's training that he couldn't remember having made a mistake. He even argued that he hadn't. I told him that unfortunately he really had forgotten something, and then showed him the video.
After the training session, we met engineer and reactor specialist Tigran Alekian, who experienced the Russian occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. He spent the next 4 months working there under pressure before fleeing together with his family. He watched the stressful exercise, but it was only training, not a real emergency.
Now, just imagine how the people who worked alongside me in Zaporizhzhia felt when Russian troops were in the streets. Our families were in danger.
What happened in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant ran contrary to the rules.
Before the shift began, the staff underwent a health check. The aim was to make sure that everyone in the control room was feeling fine, that each person was fully responsive and in good shape. This was done prior to each shift. But imagine how we all felt under the occupation. As it turned out, not one of us was able to meet the mental and physical requirements of the job.
Staff here at Khmelnytsky are all totally fit for work. Nevertheless, the war remains a threat because of the possibility not only of a power blackout, but also of other emergencies like sensitive components being destroyed. And files here do not contain instructions for handling every kind of emergency. The nuclear power plant also has an underground emergency control room for the reactors. This bunker has gained in importance.
Since the war began, we've had an internal crisis center there, which is occupied round the clock. There's always one manager present. The members of this emergency crew are relieved every 12 hours.
The new regulations at the nuclear power plant are designed to prevent a repetition of the accident at Chernobyl in 1986. Back then, it could have had a serious impact on Kiev, but the capital was not in the main direction of the wind. Documentation relating to the reactor disaster is housed in the Chernobyl Museum. An exhibition centers on the occupation of the nuclear power plant in February 2022. Valery Siminov experienced it. At the time, he was a civilian in charge of plant security. When the Russians invaded, he was about to be relieved at the end of his 10-day shift. One of the main routes taken by the Russian invaders went through the exclusion zone, close to the nuclear power plant, and past a surveillance camera. February 24th, 2022. Russian forces advanced right up to the nuclear power plant, occupied it, and mined it. Resistance was virtually non-existent. According to Valery Seminov, there was great concern that any fighting might cause widespread radioactive contamination.
Наши нацгвардейцы, да, которые сейчас в плену, которых увезли оккупанты.
I don't know why there was no armed resistance, why there was no fighting.
О том, почему они не противостояли, почему не было боевых действий, все. Но я знаю одно,
But I do know that a combat tank and 2 armored scout vehicles moved forward and aimed their cannon at the reactors and other sensitive facilities,
и 2 БМП направленные стволы были на энергоблоки, на все. Внутри находится
including the
куча
pools
разных
for highly radioactive
включая
fuel.
хранилище отработанного отработанных материалов.
Valery Semenov was present when the shift manager at Chernobyl negotiated with the Russian military.
Вы понимаете, вообще отдаете себе ответственность, что вы совершили
He told them that the occupation was nuclear terrorism. General Burakov and Colonel Frolenkov had this slight smirk on their faces, as if it didn't concern them.
Вот что у генерала Буракова, что у Фроленкова, у полковника.
As if they had merely violated some minor traffic regulation.
Легкое правило дорожного движения нарушили.
The shift manager was able to make the generals see that in order to prevent a disaster, staff had to continue working undisturbed.
После того, как вот переговоры на начальном этапе
After the initial negotiations with the occupiers, the staff left the bunker, had something to eat, and went back to work.
И возвращаться на рабочие места. Вот тогда уже на каждом рабочем месте сформировалось, кто-то из стульев составил на рабочих местах и вместо кровати, скажем так. Кто-то столы сдвинул. Так, мы пытались, мы же не можем бросить объект и просто лечь спать.
Valery Semenov showed us the most heavily contaminated areas of the exclusion zone. Of all places, it was precisely there that the Russian soldiers dug in. The remnants of their stay are still visible. They also ate and slept in their positions. We wanted to check out this severely contaminated area. Yulia Betstija from the exclusion zone administration showed us the way and made sure we didn't stray into a minefield. There are reports on the internet that Russian soldiers suffered acute radioactive sickness with external symptoms like serious burns. This can prove fatal. We wanted to find out if it was feasible. The values we measured varied greatly. Compared with natural radioactivity, 0.32 microsieverts per hour is only slightly above normal. But this reading is roughly 10 times higher. Food packaging next to trenches which are now full of water. 0.17 microsieverts on the edge here. It could be a lot higher down below though. Don't you think?
Може бути більше, тому що воно наповнене водою, тому що вони піднімали з ґрунту. Ви ж видели, вони там і ели, і жили, ели, пили. Они постоянно здесь перебывали. И это очень опасно для здоровья.
Those were the highest readings we took. They tally with an assessment by the German Office for Radiation Protection that a stay of 35 days here would have led to an increased cancer risk, but that acute radiation burns would have been ruled out. We wanted to meet other people who experienced the Russian occupation of Chernobyl, so we traveled via Kiev to Zaporizhzhia, a small town outside the exclusion zone and close to the border with Belarus. It's here that most of the Chernobyl workforce live. Zaporizhzhia was purpose-built for the nuclear power station workers after the disaster. Their old residential site had become uninhabitable. Even today, 2,500 people still work for the stricken nuclear power plant. There is a medical outpatient unit at Chernobyl nuclear power station. Ludmila Mikhayenko was the medical supervisor at the nuclear power plant the night it was occupied by Russian forces. The order to go into the bunker left her with little time.
Собирали огромные баулы медикаментов, перевязки,
We packed huge holdalls full of dressings and medication.
Не только с ранениями еще. всевозможными.
Fortunately, no one was injured. When she and her team were able to return to the medical unit from the bunker, the threat from the occupiers still hovered over them.
Я не давала себе бояться, потому что я должна была оказывать поддержку, помощь медицинскую, какую-то чисто моральную, психологическую поддержку работникам, которые также имели уже серьезные проблемы со здоровьем.
And her thoughts were focused not only on her colleagues at the nuclear power plant.
У меня сестра, двое маленьких племянников. И вот как бы изначально я очень сильно переживала за них. И был открытым вопрос, где будут находиться дети, где будет находиться моя сестра военнослужащая. Вот. Поэтому было переживательный такой момент.
Ludmila's sister has 2 children and also lives in Slavutich. Oksana Cherkasov is an officer in the Ukrainian army. She's a widow. When the attack began, she was immediately deployed for several days. Fortunately, she was quickly able to organize for her mother to come and look after her 2 children. While she was at war, her little daughter drew pictures. Throughout the entire occupation, all the female staff stayed in the medical outpatient unit. Their families in Slavutich had no idea how they were faring.
Тому за сестру дуже велике хвилювання, щоб вони не забрали в полон, або там кудись їх не закрили, і це також у нас викликало дуже велике хвилювання. Ось тому дуже було тривожно на душі. Каждый день мы молились о том, что мама, а также я о том, что Бог должен услышать, и она должна быть с нами вместе.
We wanted to visit the site and find out how dangerous the Russian occupation of the nuclear power plant was. The new sarcophagus. Under this sheet metal shroud lie the traces of the disaster of 1986. Back then, the reactor core burned for 11 days, and radioactive particles were deposited all over Europe. In the control area in the interior of the nuclear power plant, strict rules apply. We have to wear protective clothing to prevent radioactive particles being deposited on our skin. The nuclear power station has long been shut down. Electricity production here in the reactor hall in Block 3 ended in 2000. The fuel elements were all removed and taken to a spent fuel pool. Directly above the empty reactor, we still measured 6.1 microsieverts per hour, 40 times more than normal background radiation. The fuel elements were located beneath the small square-shaped panels. Here in Unit 3, nothing has been destroyed, but the situation in Unit 4 is totally different. Archive footage of a risky survey of the interior some 20 years after the disaster. What we see are destroyed fuel elements. Most of them melted and flowed into the basement as highly radioactive lava. Back then, radioactivity was millions of times higher. This area has remained unchanged right through to the present day. On leaving the reactor hall, we had to be checked for radioactivity. The corridor is a reminder of the glorious days of nuclear power before the disaster. I asked the press spokesman accompanying us if he too was in the nuclear power plant when the Russians occupied it.
During the occupation, only the night shift.
He said he wasn't on the night shift when the invaders came, and that during the night only crucial positions are filled. At the time, 120 people were at work in the plant. Actually, far too few to maintain operation for any length of time, he said, and they were not relieved. The nuclear power plant is getting on, but it will have to be operated for many years to come. Deconstruction of the highly radioactive ruin is still a long way off. We have reached the control room for the electrical systems. Shift manager Alexei Shelestsky was on duty here during the Russian occupation. Day after day he had to look on as one electricity connection after another was shelled and destroyed. The last power line was hit on the 9th of March. From then on, the power plant was in blackout. Afterwards, the new sarcophagus, which seals off the radioactive nuclear ruin and other important systems, had to be supplied through emergency generators.
The new sarcophagus is full of all kinds of sensors for earthquake activity, radioactive radiation, and so on. Without electricity, of course, nothing would function. Things would work for a short time on the power from batteries, but then everything would be dead. Then we'd have absolutely no idea what was happening inside the sarcophagus.
What's more, at Chernobyl, there is still a pool containing around 21,000 spent fuel elements.
Without electricity, the pumps in the cooling basins would stop working. Then everything could overheat and radiation would be released. There would be severe radioactive contamination.
There were only enough diesel reserves for 14 hours, and there was a staff shortage.
Один специалист, который отвечал за вот эти вот дизельные генераторы, он 3 суток фактически не спал. Это был предел. Вот за этого человека было настолько переживательно, настолько волнительно. То есть тут осмотр был 3-4, то есть вплоть до того, что плохо.
For a few days, the Russian military supplied diesel oil. Finally, the power station was connected up to the Russian electricity network. The shift gradually developed into a kind of emergency routine. But working without being relieved was very tough, especially on the shift manager. The Russian military also realized that the situation couldn't go on, so they agreed to the team being relieved. But 13 volunteers remained in the occupied nuclear power plant. The rest arrived at the town square in Slavutich on March 20th, and Lyudmila Mihalenko was at last reunited with her family.
We wept for joy. It was so special, something we had yearned for every one of 600 hours.
Це взагалі просто якісь, мені здається, народження. Нове народження. Нас як сім'ї ще більше це пробудило те, що ми дійсно не можемо один без одного. І тепер цінуємо кожну хвилину нашого життя.
A week later, the occupiers withdrew. The longest shift in the history of the nuclear industry had come to an end.
It was like a bad dream, one that had lasted non-stop for 44 days. Yes, 44 days.
The sheet metal sarcophagus is a real risk, especially in wartime. It offers no protection from shelling. Everything could collapse, and a highly radioactive cloud of dust could contaminate the entire region. At the monument to all those who helped in the disaster in 1986, we met Alexander Pintelin. He only recently joined the air defense team at Chernobyl. Before then, Pintelin worked as a civilian at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant 500 kilometers away. On March the 3rd, 2022, he helped defend his hometown against the Russian military.
Они ходили 3 дня возле города.
They had been outside the town for 3 days.
На блокпост стояли,
We had put up street
не давали им
barricades and
пройти.
kept them
Нам
out.
дали команду, что можно
We were
разойтись
then
домой,
ordered to
пока
go home and get
покушать.
something to eat.
Только домой
We barely
пришли,
got
они
home
начали
when
заходить
they
в город.
marched in.
Они заезжали,
They drove
танки
into the
первые
town
пустили.
first, firing from
Мы уже
tanks.
стреляли с танков,
But
но
all
у
we
нас
had
ничего не было.
were normal weapons.
Люди с ружьями обычными.
The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is still occupied by Russian troops, lies in southeastern Ukraine, right on the Dnipro River, which also marks the front line. Power station staff live in ENDEVR alongside the plant. With a workforce of 11,000 and 6 reactors, Zaporizhzhia is the biggest nuclear power station in Europe. March the 4th, 2022, Russian forces surrounded the plant and shelled it. In the training center, fires broke out.
Моя саморабота
I was working in the reactor hall in the control area. We were responsible for the fuel elements. Suddenly, we heard a shell being fired. 2 seconds later, it hit. The shell went through the roof of our special building and also put a hole in the intermediate ceiling, just as my colleagues were coming from the workshop. They scattered, with debris falling on their heads. We also noticed that there was a hole in the wall of our special building where the fresh fuel elements were stored.
Alexander Pantelin invited us to his home. He and his family fled to Slavutich, where he now lives in one room with daughter Camilla, son Nikita, and wife Ekaterina. Their old apartment was near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Мы слышали все. Этот запах от стрельбы, было жутко. Это все продолжалось, началось где-то в районе 4 часов вечера, 4, начало 5, где-то так, да? Я уже точно не помню. И продолжалось четко до 4:45 утра, без остановки. Били постоянно, стреляли, гремели. Когда мы поняли, что они повернули на атомную, было страшно за сам этот объект.
The first families left town right after the nuclear power plant was occupied. A few weeks later, Ekaterina Pantelin also wanted to flee, together with her children.
Муж сказал, я буду оставаться до конца, работать, сколько смогу, а вы выезжаете. Я собирала чемоданы, но что-то не слаживалось. А потом отложила эту идею и сказала, будем дожидаться, вот сколько сможем терпеть, будем дожидаться своих.
In addition to his job at the nuclear power plant, Alexander Pantelin told us he also began to do some scouting for the Ukrainian military.
Прилеты вот в спецкорпусе у нас, где наши мастерские.
We also tried to talk to someone who still works at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but they were too scared. But then we did manage to establish an online contact with someone who has to remain anonymous.
Was sind die schlimmsten
What are the
Beispiele
worst
für
examples of
Gewaltanwendung
violence
gegenüber der
committed against
Belegschaft
power
in
plant
AKW?
staff?
Fortunately, I myself never experienced any violence, but many of our friends were arrested and disappeared. They checked the phone of one of our friends and found chat groups that were banned. They then searched her flat, and on her husband's phone, they found even more material that was critical of Russia. In the end, an entire chat group was arrested.
We received several reports of this kind, but not at first hand, and we couldn't check them all independently. But the fact is that the Russian operating company of nuclear power plants pressurized employees into switching to it.
On December the 1st, they cancelled my company ID because I refused to sign a Russian contract. Since then, I have been replaced by Russian technicians who don't have a valid license. They know about this type of power plant, but they've not been trained to use our system. Even at our plant units 1 and 6 are different, and there is a huge difference from a Russian nuclear power plant. That's why they need my qualification in the event of an emergency. So they refuse to allow me and my family to leave the town. In an emergency, they would come to our home and take me back to work by force. But fortunately, that hasn't happened yet.
For 6 months, the Russian military also left the Pintelin family in peace. But then, on September the 3rd, 2022, Alexander Pintelin caught their attention.
I discovered that various yards contained a lot of military equipment. It was just sitting there. So I drove past to take a look. That's when I was spotted by 2 Chechens and a Russian. They immediately stopped me and asked me where I was going. I said I was heading for the reservoir. To convince them, I showed them the fishing rods I had in my rucksack. One of the Chechens remembered me, because 2 days earlier they had already stopped and photographed me. He showed the police chief the photos of me in my car. He said I was too close to their military equipment and ordered me to be checked out. They put me in their vehicle and drove me to our apartment building. My car was parked outside. They searched it, but didn't find anything. They entered our apartment with guns, even though I'd asked them not to do so because of the children. If people are unarmed, there's no immediate danger. But still, they were armed. They found my uniform, but it was old. I'd worn it 20 years ago as a conscript.
As part of their search, they also wanted to check our cell phones. I managed to switch off my husband's phone and hide it so that they wouldn't find it. Instead, I gave them our little son's cell phone to check. At first, they were suspicious, but then they accepted it. Stored on it were all my husband's business contacts.
Там были и рабочие телефоны, они синхронизировались. За свой телефон я чуть-чуть не подумала, положила его на видное место. Его взяли на проверку, а там много чего было, что не стоило как бы.
They took my military ID card and my passport with them and said we should report on Monday for what they called an interview.
Мы знали, что будет с нами, если мы пойдем на этот допрос, потому что я понимала, что они вытащат с моего телефона.
Они даже угрожали еще внизу, когда возле подъезда.
We'll take you down to the basement. We've got a machine there. You'll be given electric shocks and will tell us everything.
Начинаем крутить, ты все нам расскажешь.
On September the 1st, 2022, at a time when the situation for the Pintelin family was getting worse, observers from the International Atomic Energy Agency visited the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant for the first time. They found widespread violation of the safety regulations. What alarmed them in particular were the multiple losses of connection to the electricity grid. We are on our way to ENDEVR Atom, the company which operates all of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. They meet over half the country's electricity requirements. The concern's acting president, Petro Kotin, used to be plant manager at Zaporizhzhia. The nuclear power plant was shut down in autumn 2022 and has to be supplied with electricity by other power stations. Cotin underlined the importance of the plant having a functioning connection to the power grid.
You need constantly to supply electricity, and for that you have diesel generators on each nuclear power plant. If you lose external power, then diesel generators start it up, and after that they supply electricity to the pumps, which actually cool these fuel assemblies. And then this is the last defense of the nuclear power plant before the catastrophe, and after that there will be meltdown of the cores of reactors.
The reason for the cooling requirement is linked to the controlled chain reaction which takes place in a reactor. The core of a uranium atom is struck by a neutron. New neutrons are released and continue to split nuclei. This creates the heat for the turbines. When the plant is shut down, control rods bind the neutrons. But even when the nuclear fission comes to an end, follow-up processes still take place, because the fission products continue to decay. More and more decay products occur in an inevitable reaction in which a lot of heat is given off. That's why fuel elements still have to be cooled for many years and threaten to melt if power is lost.
Never could imagine this situation, this degradation of security to this low levels, and you have 6 blackouts at the biggest nuclear power plant in Ukraine and also in Europe.
The war against Ukraine's electricity grid began in October 2022. Substations were a preferred target. The control center of the city of Kiev's electricity supply was also hit, so it was moved to a sacred location, as was the control center for the whole of Ukraine. The administrative building of state concern Ukrenergo is still intact. There we met its CEO, Volodymyr Kruditsky, who's responsible for the national electricity grid, just like on the day of the worst attack on it so far.
Is there any real action we could cover?
The Russians picked up the days of attacks based on the weather forecasts. So they tried to initiate full blackout of the system so that the water supply and heating systems would be frozen, and that would create unspeakable humanitarian catastrophe. You think about chemical plants that could explode without electricity supply. You think about nuclear units that need to be cooled down.
On November 23, 2022, all 4 active nuclear power plants were cut off from the national grid. A total of 15 reactors, and the Chernobyl atomic power station, which had been closed, had to be supplied once again with emergency power too. That had never happened before.
It is a very dangerous situation. We theoretically discussed it, and we had special training actually on our simulators how to operate in this case, but nobody would expect that this could happen in reality.
To prevent a disaster, the team from Ukrenergo had to carry out swift repair work, even risking their lives. Within 14 hours, the national grid was functioning again. That winter, 70 mobile operational teams with a total of 1,500 staff defended Ukraine's electricity infrastructure. They repaired complex transformers and compensators in the substations and around 10,000 kilometers of high-tension power lines. That was only possible because Ukrenergo had made provisions.
The secret is that we accumulated huge stock of equipment and materials before the invasion. Because if big modern war happens, it means that the adversary will shell your power grid. Specifically your power grid, nothing else, power grid. And everyone should be prepared.
For the future, he suggests setting up a joint European spare part depot. The Pintelin family had to react quickly because the dangerous summons still hung over them.
Мы смогли связаться с стороной Украины, с военными, и нам дали два варианта. Или вы выезжаете вот утром рано, или вы остаетесь и стоите на своем, да, вот от всего отбрехиваетесь. Мы ничего не знаем, глупости, читали новости, ну такое. Сможете, не сможете. Я понимала, что я не смогу, потому что есть точки давления, есть дети. Я только просила Бога, чтобы мы беспроблемно выехали, зная, как выезжали другие, сколько проверок, сколько блокпостов. Было страшно. Вдруг на каком-то посту что-то случится, и вот где-то мы что-то не пройдем.
To avoid immediately attracting attention as a family, they set off separately. Early in the morning, a friend took Ekaterina Pintelin and the children across the city boundary. Alexandra Pintelin took his own car, allegedly to get to his garden. This claim got him through the first checkpoint. The rest of the family got into the car, and together they made it through 2 more control points.
Где-то около 7 часов утра мы были уже в Васильевске. Мы доехали, стали в очередь, запускали на блокпост на проверку по 10 машин. Неважно, в этой очереди автобус, микроавтобус, по 10 машин. Когда мы подъехали к началу этой колонны, оказалось, что мы ведущая машина. Когда уезжала колонна перед нами, мы увидели, что военный, который там стоял, начал махать, и мы подумали, что он просит нас. И начали ехать, машина заглохла. Как бы в этой панике люди стали помогать, вытолкали. У меня аж мутнело в глазах. То ли он махал стоять, муж понял, и почти перед блокпостом он остановился.
Когда я остановился, я понимаю, я смотрю в зеркало заднего вида, я смотрю, все как стояли, так и стоят. Один я только подъехал.
Я думаю, Господи, мало того, что нас могут искать, мы еще тут что-то, где-то на что-то нарываемся. У меня сердце вылетало, голова так разболелась. И я вижу, этот нехороший человек идет к нашей машине. Ну, благо, я в смысле, что он, как наказать твоего мужа? Ну, он решил обочину, чтобы он убрал получается, вот это вот в 10 машин, которые становятся, вот эту вот часть надо убрать, мусор, который люди же накидывают, и начался досмотр. Я вытащила все чемоданы, муж еще продолжал там немножко убирать. И по мне, хорошо, что его не было рядом. И муж ехал по ксерокопии. У меня спросили, а где документы мужа? Я говорю, еще в начале марта потерял, так как надо было ходить с документами. Ну ладно, они отмахнулись, и все. И мы выехали, ну как говорили нам, что есть еще 2 поста в Васильевке. И тоже там будут проверять.
The Pintelins' biggest concern, which becomes evident again as they tell us their story, was their children. The family had heard that the Russian military were often guilty of assaults. Such reports have also accumulated at ENDEVR Atom. The state concern's chief executive told us that so far 200 people have been mishandled.
They started raids to their homes and to their apartments. They start capturing the staff and put them in a so-called pit. And in this pit, those people were in there and were beaten and tortured.
Petro Kotin told us that 30 people have disappeared completely, but they could also have fled without telling anyone.
We know for sure that one person was beaten to death, and from our staff, and another person was actually shot in attempt to kill him, but it got like 5 bullets in his body, but he survived and he is alive right now.
There is no reliable information on what's happening in Zaporizhzhia. The Russian army is said to have stationed a lot of military equipment there in the assumption that Ukraine will not want to cause a nuclear catastrophe and so will not mount a direct attack because heavy shelling could be dangerous.
If any projectile would go and would point on this material somehow, then you will have already catastrophe with radiation release. If you damage one only fuel assembly, this is small impact would be on the environment. If you damage the full core of one reactor, for example, the consequences would be the same, like, for example, in Chernobyl.
The risk emanating from a nuclear power plant depends on how much radioactive material it contains. Zaporizhzhia has 6 reactors, each equipped with 163 fuel elements. Next to each reactor is a cooling pool for spent fuel elements. There is also a dry fuel storage facility for old fuel elements. It consists of 174 steel containers encased in concrete. In all, there are 8,700 fuel elements in Zaporizhzhia. Kiev is 500 kilometers from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Berlin, 1,700. In Germany, experts calculate every day in which direction the wind would blow a radioactive cloud from Zaporizhzhia. On this particular day, for instance, it would travel northeast to Russia. The country lies in the main direction the wind blows in. But on 60 days of the year, the radiation would also be carried towards Western Europe. But even then, the Federal Office for Radiation Protection assumes there would be no risk to people in Germany or in neighboring countries. The Pintelin family was still fleeing, and another 2 checkpoints still lay ahead.
Нам надо последний проехать. Вот. И мы эти 2 поста пролетели. Но столько удивления было, думаю, Господи, Ты меня услышал. Все мои молитвы, которые были всю ночь и целый день, это просто, я же говорю, везение до безумия. Была зона, через которую проезжали все люди. Нас ее называют, все, кто выезжает, это дорога жизни. Это единственная дорога, по которой можно было уехать на Украину. Мы въехали, и только вот первые моменты мы включили музыку украинскую. В сердце так было «Ура!» Дочка провезла в носке украинскую ленточку. Мы ее в серой же зоне повязали на зеркало машины. И вот с этой музыкой рванули уже к нашим постам. Скажу, это даже когда вспоминается сейчас, аж слезы наворачиваются. Было и радостно, и грустно от того, что мы оставили дом, и родителей, и все было. Мы так шли.
In the months that followed, it was hard for all 4 of them to work through their experience of the occupation. Daughter Camilla painted.
Нет, это состояние души, так скажем.
It's not a self-portrait, she says, but more of a look into her soul. The words say, I have something in my heart that will never die. June the 6th, 2023. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continued to make the headlines when the Nova Kakova dam was breached. The entire region was affected. Downstream, there was disastrous flooding. But upstream there was low water, and that's where Zaporizhzhia lies. Its cooling lake no longer had any inflow. On June the 15th, 2023, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspected the water level.
Behind me, what you can see is the cooling pond. Essential for the safety of this plant is that the water that you see behind me stays at that level.
Since the nuclear power plant has been shut down, it needs less water. At present, it is only being cooled through several small cooling ponds. But it is vital that they remain intact. The inspectors found that the spraying devices are functioning, so there is no acute risk, they say. June 29th, 2023. In the Zaporizhzhia region, disaster prevention teams rehearsed a serious radioactive accident scenario because Ukraine fears that if the Russian military withdrew, they might only want to destroy the nuclear power station. As long as the war continues, all of Ukraine's nuclear power plants will remain a threat, even without direct challenge. In 1986, Chernobyl became a memorial to reactor disasters. And today, Ukraine is again showing the whole world the underestimated danger of nuclear power. On our research trip, we met some impressive people who ensure safety in nuclear power plants. Nevertheless, in wartime, the risk of a major nuclear accident increases. People under stress, the breakdown of communication and safety systems, the shortage of spare parts, wrecked power station technology and no power. All these problems have already occurred in this war. The risks are incalculable. When they were built, no one envisaged nuclear power stations being involved in a war.